I'm going to show how to make this overlapping scales effect using Affinity Photo's procedural texture filter. I had a previous video that showed how to make a scales effect using cell noise, but I thought I'd try to make one like this for this type of scale that has sort of the layered look or the overlapping scaled pattern to it. These could maybe also be used for something like leaves or maybe even feathers. Things like that. I'm going to do this in two steps. First, I'm going to make the overall shape of the scale, then I'll add a lighting effect on top of it. To get started, I'll start with a new 1024 by 1024 document, and I'll fill that with black and add a live procedural texture filter to that. Start with a new equation, assign it to all three channels. I'm going to add an A custom input for the scale. To get started, I'll start with variable v equals vec2 of rx comma ry times A divided by w, and then I'll put in v to show what that looks like. When I look at the shape of scales and started comparing that to the oscillator shapes, the oscillator that I thought would work pretty well for this would be oschrt. So to get started, I'll start with oschrt of v.x. That looks like that. And then to show the sort of the cross-section shape of that, I'm going to take v.y minus oschrt of v.x. It looks like that. Now to make this repeat, I'm going to try OSC, an oscillator of all of this. That should give me sort of this repeating pattern. So that looks pretty close to what I want in terms of the basic shape of the scale. It sort of curves down, it's pointed at the bottom, but one of the things I'd like to do is to have this bright line down here at the bottom and then go to a dark line. So the function that does that, instead of just regular oscillator function, I want to use the fraction routine. So let's see how that looks. Okay, so that's pretty good. It sort of doesn't give me anything up here with the negative numbers, but if I drag this up, now I have this function that goes from 0 up to almost 1, so 0 to 0.99. Then it starts over 0 to 0.99. So fraction takes the fractional part of a real number. That's pretty close to what I want. I'd like them to be a little narrower, and actually maybe it'd be nice to be able to control the width of these. So I'm going to add a slider, 0 to 1 range. I'll just call it I, and call this one size. I'll call this one scale width. And I'm going to multiply Rx times 4 times I. And now I can adjust the width of these with the slider so they can get very wide or narrow. And I'm going to set them up about like that for now. And I'm going to bring this down a little to about 4. So I can see what they look like. That looks pretty good. However, instead of having this dark line in the middle and a bright line over here on the edge, I'd like to have a bright line in the middle and sort of have it go darker near the edge. So I need to add on another oscillator to do that, and I'm going to just make this into a variable. So I'll make this variable t1 equals all of this, and then let's look at another oscillator that would do that. So if I just look at the OSC oscillator, v.x, that sort of does what I want. It has bright area here and then dark area here. So if I add that to my current oscillator, I should be able to get those different bright and dark areas. So I'm going to do that. I'll just add that on here and see what that looks like. So it's a little too bright. There's some issues with this. So I'll do T1 so I can work with this. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to multiply this by a factor that I can, it's getting larger than 1, and that's sort of washing out the intensity of this. So I'm going to multiply this by a factor I1, and that will be a 0 to 1 slider. And so when I bring that down, I can see that, yes, it made a nice peak here. This one is still sort of bright right there, but it is having something of an effect. However, I think I'd like to have be able to control how strong that effect is. So I'm going to go in and multiply this by 2 times I2 times that, and I'll add another 0 to 1 slider for I2. So let's call this one depth, and I'll call this one concave. And so I can go all the way down here, and then as I bring this up, I can make this more and more concave. The next step is to make a duplicate of this function, then move it so it's offset down in this position, and then I'll use the max function to create the overlapping effect. I'm going to take this all of t1 and make a new variable, t2. Over here I'm going to take max of t1 comma t2, and then I'll use the slider to control that whole thing. And now it doesn't look like there's any difference, but I'm going to add an offset to this. So I'm just going to add plus b over here to the vy and plus c over here and over here. And I'll add 2 more sliders. And then I can control the position of these. So if I leave C at 1, let's see, C at 0 looks like that. Leave C up at 1. Position B at 0.5. I don't think I'll need to move these around anymore. So I'm going to just get rid of these 2 sliders and put in those values. We'll change B to 0.5 and C to 1. So that's the basic scale pattern. It looks pretty good. I'd also like to have instead of just the depth here, I'd like to have an offset so I can control how bright it is. I'm going to make that -1 to 1 slider. I'll call it OF, and I'm just going to call it offset. I'll add that on to my function over here. And now I can control the darkness of that. I can make it, give it a little more depth here and bring it down like that. So I have more contrast in my scales. Right now, that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add a adjustment layer, a gradient to this. And this is one I developed before. I could use that one or that one. But to show how I got these, I'm just going to start with the default. And then this will probably work better if I have a dark color over here. So I'm just going to make that pretty dark. And then a light color over here. So I'll make that pretty much white. So I could start with that, or maybe I'll make this a little bit darker value of green. And then I could make this, instead of just pure white, maybe just a little bit off-white. And this one I could make, instead of pure black, I could bring it up just a little bit. So I just adjust those until I get a color gradient that I like, and that looks pretty good, I think, like that. So at this point, it looks pretty good, but it'd be nice to have, I thought it'd be more interesting to have a little bit of texture surface texture on top of these, so that's what I'm going to do next. I'm just going to temporarily assign this to a variable just so I don't have to see it. I'll call it T4. And then I'm going to look at another oscillator of v.x, like that. I'm going to see the gradient. I'm going to drop that down here. Just turn it off for now. Now for this one, for a surface texture, I'd like to have a different scale than my previous pattern. So I'd like this to have a lot smaller scale. I'm going to add a real value, and I'm going to have this surface scale, and just set that up to about 10, and I'll multiply this by b, like that. So now I can control that pattern. I want to add some turbulence to this, so I'm going to multiply by t times noisehsc, so it's the smooth curve and then the harmonic version of that, and then I'll put in v times b, and I want to also be able to scale this, so I'm going to multiply by another factor, ts. So that's what that looks like. I've got turbulence and my turbulence scaling factor as custom inputs down here. So I could have a lot of turbulence or just a little. And then I can control the frequency of that relative to the surface scale. That can be at a higher frequency than my surface scale. Let's leave that at 2. This will work pretty well at 10. Okay, I've got that set up. I'm going to make this into a variable T3, and then I'm going to show T4 again, like that, and then on this variable I'll just add T3 to that. And I've got to have this one before, I've got to define this one before I define my T4. So I'm going to move it over here. Now this is dominating too much, so I'm going to add a scaling factor for that. I'll just call it I3, and that will be my surface amount. I'll call it depth. Over here, I'm going to multiply by I3. Now I can bring this down, and then just bring in a little bit of that. Now, most of this range isn't useful to me, so I'm going to divide by 2, I think, so that I have more useful range on that control. I'll never want to go that high, but that's pretty good useful range for that one. I want it to be sort of subtle, so I'm going to keep it low. Now I can turn on my gradient, and you can see that effect. Now that I've got this set up, I'll show the concavity. So I could have if I bring this up quite a bit, I've got to bring this down to compensate for that. You can see it changes the overall shape of the scale quite a bit when I do that. I'm going to bring this back, just this one, until it has more of a rounded shape for now. And just bring this down here. When I get a pattern I like, I can add a lighting effect. To do that, I'm going to turn off the gradient map, go to a grayscale, go to Layer, Merge Visible to capture that grayscale level. And then I'm going to go to previous, where I have this pattern saved. I'm going to use my Phong 0 and a normal map. Turn those off. First I'll add the normal map to this. Turn that on again. You can see that pattern. So this edge is very sharp. And if I bring this one in, it gives sort of a harsh lighting effect. I'm going to add a Gaussian blur effect this and bring it down inside of here, and then bring this up. It gives my lighting effect, makes it look so it's not quite so harsh. The regular pattern doesn't look too bad, but the lighting effect is pretty harsh without that. Now I can turn on my gradient map, and then I'll change this to a lighting layer. So I'll just use the overlay. I think that one looks pretty good. It still looks a little bit harsh on the edges, so I could add a Gaussian blur to this step too if I wanted to, but that's a general overall scales pattern. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.